Welcome, everybody, to the official Noises Power Music YouTube channel. I'm your host, main author on the website, Carl Gianelli. And basically, what I do, if you haven't checked out the blog, is I cover all things alternative and underground music and culture. And this is the first, hopefully, of many interviews that we have in terms of a Zoom video format. And I am honored and privileged today to be joined by the one and only Steve Haigler, who's worked on a plethora of records over. How many years have you been recording, Steve? How long has it been?
God, like a million. I guess I was in the business for at least uh, 40 plus years.
40 plus years.
Yeah, from the time I was very young.
Okay. Yeah. So I definitely want to get into the early years and everything, no doubt, which we'll get into in a moment. But Steve has worked on a ton of records that I'm sure if you're a fan of the kind of stuff that we cover on our website, you'll be more than familiar with. I'm not going to ruin the surprise. We'll get there. But I guess, Steve, the first thing that I really want to ask you about is just kind of your first encounter with music in your life. Like, what made you want to be interested in music? Were you in bands? That kind of thing. How did that come to be a part of your life?
Well, I mean, from a very early age, my mother was always into the popular music of the day.
Sure.
And I mean, when I was really little, um, she would take me down to the local store in the shopping center up the street and buy me a 45 of whatever I'd heard on the radio that week.
Awesome. Okay.
So, I was constantly putting on a stack of singles and, playing drums along to the records and
Okay.
with my mom. So that's how I first had my love of music. Um, but when I actually started out in the business, I was doing live sound
Mm.
for a regional band that was based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live, where I grew up, um, and the band had a production arrangement with Reflection Studios here in Charlotte, which
Okay.
is awesome, awesome, awesome place. So we would go in after hours and record our own stuff, and
Okay.
that was my first studio experience.
Were you the drummer? You said you were a drummer?
No, I was doing live sound.
Oh, doing live sound for that band. Okay. My bad.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. So I was on the road with them for about a year, and then when the band broke up, I went to the studio owner and I said, hey Wayne, I know you need some help here, and you don't really know me, but I'll make a deal with you. I'll work here for 30 days for free. And
Mm.
at the end of that time, you tell me.
Yeah.
And of course, he started paying me after the first week.
That's good.
And I was there for over 11 years before I went independent.
All right. So you mentioned live sound before studio work. What what made you want to get into live sound, I guess? Start there. How did
Just,
that come about?
just love of music.
Yeah.
And, even from the time I was very young, I was, what's the proper term? I guess very analytical about the way I listened to music.
Hmm.
I would listen to the drum part, I would listen to the bass line, I would listen to guitars, keyboards, whatever. I would dissect the track
Sure.
from a very early age because learning all the parts and just really digging into the track.
Oh yeah.
And I think doing live mixing was probably the next logical step, really.
Right.
Get out there in different acoustic environments, get your mix together, and have a good time every night.
Well, that and there's kind of the visual aspect of it too, a bit, right? Where like you're seeing the band right in front of you on a big stage. Because you said you started by kind of dissecting records, listening to them in your room, that kind of thing. That's one thing. It's another thing when you actually could see a group of human beings up on a stage with all the instruments. You got the sliders and the faders right there. You get to do it in real time.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
assuming that had part to do with it. Going back to the records, were there any particular records or anything that like you remember really picking apart where you were like, it was an early kind of mind-blowing thing where you're like, oh my God, like I can't believe the way that this
Well,
gets put together. Because you mentioned singles, but were there any records or anything like that?
oh yeah. Well, later on, when I started getting an allowance, pretty much all my allowance went to vinyl.
Sure.
You know,
I can rely, I get you.
of course, until the time I hit 16, then you got to have gas money.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I mean, a lot of my early allowance went to buying vinyl. Absolutely, and it was all kinds of music, really. you know, like I said, my mom was into the pop music of the day, and that's
Right.
what I began listening to. And you know, I can remember some of my dad's old Elvis records, and
Okay.
you know, and I can't say that I'm a huge Elvis fan, but
Sure.
you know,
Popular music
that's
of the day, though. Yeah.
exactly. You know, we're talking, you know, uh, early '60s. You
Okay.
know, so,
So like Beach Boys, Beatles, that kind of stuff, or am I off base with that?
no, Beatles would have been slightly later, but yeah, you know,
Sure.
all that stuff. You know, and you know, as far as specific records, I couldn't even begin to remember, but just all that stuff
Yeah.
of that age, you
But
know.
when it comes to arranging and all of that and understanding how pieces fit together, that's kind of the era for that, you know?
True,
Yeah.
yeah, because you know it you know, I grew up in the analog age,
Right.
you know, recording to tape, 100% performance based.
Yeah.
There's no editing, no
Right.
sound replacer,
Yeah.
none of that shit. You know,
Right.
you had to be able to play it.
Yes.
You got to be able to perform it
Absolutely.
and sell it. You know, put the energy in it, put the emotion in it.
100%.
It's all that stuff. You know, and unfortunately, much of that is gone these
Mhm.
days. But you know, and while I was chief engineer at Reflection, you know, I did a lot of live sound too. You know, we do live remote recordings. We had a remote truck, and God, I remember one session we did that was like this huge, big band jazz thing,
Okay.
and it wasn't multi-track. I had to,
Oh,
you know, do
wow.
stereo mix down to 2-track tape,
Wow. Okay.
and you know that's just nerve-wracking,
Yeah.
especially if you're not
Huge
familiar.
ensemble.
Yeah, a huge ensemble, you know, talking strings, horns, rhythm sections, singers, the whole bit. And you know, to do that live to a 2-track and be able to do it well takes uh, a lot of experience
Mhm.
and you know, a, attention to detail. And the funny thing is I remember getting all the tapes back to the studio and starting to edit them down, and we had a prototype ATR 101 machine, which was like the Mac Daddy of 2-tracks.
Mm.
And this thing had what was called a quartz controlled transport, and the transport went nuts
Okay.
while I was editing. And just I had like little 1-inch pieces of tape all over the control room where it
Oh my
just
God.
tape. So that song was dead, but yeah, you know, you do what you can.
Well, that's part of the analog age, right? I mean, I've heard the craziest stories about, just the way those old machines acted up,
Yeah,
back then. Yeah. There was a
sometimes. But you know, you learn how to edit tape. You know, you get your razor blade out and your tape, and you start cutting away and doing what you need to do. You know, and even with 2-inch tape, you know, recording 24 or 48 track analog, you know, you're editing 2-inch tape, which
sure.
is frightening for a lot of people.
Mm.
So I could edit tape like crazy, scare bands to death.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. Well, as a musician, I'm not someone that runs the tape machines. That's out of my wheelhouse. So from the other side of it, yes, it's a very terrifying thing to watch the engineer
Yeah,
come out and just slash everything that you've just done. But
you're
that's
gonna
something that
cut
you
our masters? Oh my god!
yeah. But that's something you figure out though, just like you said, being an engineer, after, years and years, session after session of doing it, there's a science to it,
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
You
going
know,
back, going back a bit to the first few engineering kind of gigs you did, you mentioned the jazz ensemble. Were there any other kind of, ones that you can remember that stick out right now that informed what you would do when it came to working with more of like the indie projects, like the indie rock bands and stuff later on from those early days? You remember picking something up where you were like, I'm not going to forget that. That
yeah.
followed you?
Well, I mean, being engineer at Reflection Studios was a first class place. I mean,
Hmm.
top notch studio, and great gear, great microphone collection, everything. Uh, an amazing big tracking room. Um, at Reflection, we were kind of the center between a hub of, I'll call it college rock.
Sure. Yep.
Back in the day, that's where bands were being broken, was on
Yes.
college radio.
Right.
And we were kind of between Boston and, like South Georgia, kind of right in the middle there. And there were indie labels in Boston, there were indie labels here in the Raleigh Durham area because of all the colleges. And, and of course in Georgia, Athens,
Yep.
that whole scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah.
a lot of bands recorded at Reflection. And I mean, you know, back in the day, we were kind of inventing the term alternative music
Right.
at Reflection because of all the cool stuff we were doing. And, but, being an engineer at Reflection, I did, whatever came in the door.
Okay. Yeah.
That's
Right.
what I'm working on.
Right.
And it was everything from gospel quartets to, you know, rock bands, jazz bands, folk, everything, So it was pretty much ran the gamut of
Okay.
stuff I was recording in my early days.
Okay. Because, yeah, what I was going to ask you was, you have credits with labels like IRS. You're credited on records came out on IRS. You're credited on records that came out on 4AD as well.
Yeah.
Bling of course. So did you ever find yourself being, associated with any of those labels where you're like, oh, we got to get Steve? Or was it like you just said, where it was like, that's the studio I was working at, and whatever came through the door, that's what I was working on, kind of thing?
Well, as far as the IRS stuff, I assume you're referring to like Let's Active and
Yep. Yes.
that kind of thing. Yeah, Mitch Easter, he's from North Carolina.
Okay.
And he lives just up the road in Winston-Salem, or right outside of Winston-Salem. And so Mitch did a lot of recording at Reflection, and I mixed a lot of his stuff, recorded a lot of his stuff. Yeah, Mitch and I go way, way back.
Okay.
As far as the 4AD stuff, that would have been right after I went independent. And I
Okay.
was basically I'm a hired gun.
Right.
Either people are hiring me to engineer and mix, or I'm being hired to produce, whatever that is. I'm an independent contractor at that point.
Okay, so tell me then, 4AD records that we're talking about, you worked with Throwing Muses for 4AD, and then you also ended up engineering, as far as I'm concerned, three of the best alternative records come out of that era. You did Trompe Le Monde Pixies, you did the Doolittle record as well, and you also did Bossanova. That's all correct? Because that's what the records say.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
correct.
So how did that happen?
Actually, um, I was in Boston, uh, working on the Throwing Muses record with
Okay.
Gary Smith producing. Super guy, good guy. Unfortunately, passed away not that long ago.
Oh wow.
Um, and it seems that Gil Norton had done some work with Throwing Muses previously,
Right.
and he was in excuse me, he was in town in Boston recording Doolittle.
Yep.
So anyway, he came by the studio one evening, while we were working, and I met Gil, and he was very impressed with what he heard coming through the studio monitors. The stuff we were working with, just the sonic value of it and all
Right.
that. He was quite impressed. And that evening, he asked me if I wanted to mix Doolittle, and I said, "Of course."
Yeah.
And ended up engineering a lot of the record, but because actually that was at the Carriage House where that record was mixed in Connecticut.
Really? Doolittle was mixed in Stanford?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But when we got to the studio to mix, he wasn't anywhere near finished.
Hmm.
So I ended up recording a large portion of that record as well, and then mixing.
So you were there during the recording process of that album.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So I've been listening to that album as far as I'm concerned, probably probably coming up on 8 to 10 years now. That record kind of helped teach me in a lot of ways about guitar tones, snare drum sounds in particular, and overall just songwriting stuff. I mean, I know it's going back a ways, but do you remember anything about what the guitar setups were like back then in terms of what Joey and Charles were playing back then? Do you remember?
Um, I do remember Charles having a Soldano head. I
Interesting.
I don't recall what Joey was playing. It seems like he had, a couple different combo amps and maybe a stack of some sort. I honestly don't remember.
Yeah.
But it's funny you mentioned the drum sounds on that record because Gil had actually engineered those basic tracks. He had recorded all bass and drums by the time I came on board. And I was freaking out
Hmm.
because he had hard gated the snare and kick to tape,
Oh, okay.
which you don't do that. And to me, it was like it just took all the breath out of the snare drum, all the depth out of the kick. And I was struggling. I said, what am I going to make out of this? And
Yeah.
that's why you hear all those crazy gated reverbs and stuff. I was trying to, just even though it may sound a little bit more artificial at times, I was trying to create something
Right.
because they were so drastically gated and it was a bit of a chore, but in the end, I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you don't need me to tell you how iconic that record has gone on to become. You don't need me to say that. But I think it's one thing that's really interesting about that album all these years later is, of course, it's the LP that comes right after Surfer Rosa that Steve Albini worked on. Rest in peace to Steve.
Love that record too.
Yeah, absolutely. But when it comes to the drum sound on that album, it's the complete antithesis of how the drums on Doolittle sound, because it's all big, massive, boomy reverb sounds on the snare.
Yeah,
Huge elongated tails on it and everything. So I think in one way, the way that Doolittle came out, it works so well because it's so sonically different from Surfer Rosa. Like if they came out of Surfer Rosa Part Two, you know, Surfer Rosa as it is so special even now. There's few records out there that sound like it, So
yeah,
I think a large part of what Doolittle kind of has going for it outside of the songs, of course, is just, it's so different in the way that it sounds. I think so, at least as a listener.
yeah. I do as well. And yeah. Rest in peace, Steve Albini. I was always a huge fan.
Getting back to Doolittle real quick, the other thing I want to touch on is the Soldano head thing is really interesting to me. Like I never in a million years would have put the way Charles guitar sounds on that record with a Soldano. Because typically when you think of Soldanos, you think of like, I think Mick Mars was using them. I think the guys from Rat were using them. Like they came
Yeah,
out to be like a high gain metal amp back in the day.
yeah. But
Yeah,
um, it's not just that sound. I mean, it depends on the model you have and all that stuff. But
sure.
and I know Charles had a couple of AC30s as well,
That
Vox
makes sense.
AC30s. Um, but you may not know this, but excuse me.
All good.
Um, I was business partners with Mike Watts, and we built a recording studio in Port Jefferson, New York, called Voodoo, VUDU. If you
Okay.
got any friends up in that area that are looking for a great place to record, that's it.
Voodoo. Okay.
Yeah, VUDU. You can check it out online.
Got it.
And I was in Port Jeff for about 3.5 years, and we had a Soldano.
Hmm.
And I used to use that amp quite a bit,
Yeah.
and it wasn't for metal sounds. It was just, good, smooth distortion, you know. And so yeah, those amps can work on a lot of different things. But we had a huge collection of amps and guitars, and so getting guitar sounds at Voodoo is not a worry at all. We got
Doesn't
it all.
sound like it.
We had it all, and we still do. I mean, Mike is still running the studio. It's doing quite well, and he's become a really, really top-notch mixer and producer. I'd put Mike's mixes up against anybody's.
Okay.
He's that good.
What has he worked on recently that we should go listen to? Is there
Oh,
something that comes?
I don't know because I moved back to Charlotte like 11 years ago.
Right.
I mean, I do still talk to him, but we don't necessarily talk about what projects he's working on. We just shoot
Sure.
the, you know.
Right.
But yeah, he's done a lot of cool stuff. So, and a lot of alternative and heavier stuff as well. Uh, yeah, Mike's like my brother from another mother. He's the best.
Based out of Voodoo Studios, VUDU.
Correct. In Port Jefferson, New York.
So give it a look. Give it a look up if anyone's around this area looking to go record. Go check that out. Go check out Mike.
Yep.
So
And the
moving on.
reasonable too.
What's that?
The rates are reasonable as well.
That's always good to hear. That's
Yeah.
always good to hear. So moving away from Doolittle for a second, because Doolittle's probably my favorite Pixies record. My second favorite probably being Bossanova. A large reason for Bossanova is, and this is going to be a really kind of wacky description, the guitars on that album in particular, they've almost kind of got this like 3D kind of thing going on with them. And what I mean by that is, and I'll get to this more when we talk about some of the other bands and records that you've worked on, but a trademark on a lot of the records that you've worked on after listening to them for years is they've always got great distortion sounds. They're always really saturated, but you can always pick out what the guitar player is playing. There's always definition to it, which when I think of, your work as both an engineer and producer, that's the first thing that comes to mind is it's distorted and it's kind of chaotic, but you can get every single detail out of what the guitar player is playing. So when I listen to Bossa Nova, as soon as I hear, like Valoria or Allison or any song like that, that's one of the first things that I notice. So was there anything that changed from working on Doolittle to Bossa Nova that kind of, is the reason that we're hearing stuff like that? Am I totally off base with what I'm saying? Or,
No, I think the one thing I have to correct you on is that um, Al Clay actually engineered the largest part of Bossa Nova.
Okay.
Al Clay is a great engineer, English guy, um, and he did a great job. So I have to credit him
Sure. Yeah. No,
for
please.
that work. Um, and there again, it was another situation where I was hired to mix and it wasn't quite finished.
Right.
So I did end up doing a good deal of engineering on that record as well. But yeah, I have to give the credit to Al for those most of those guitar sounds. I mean,
Okay.
really good engineer, good guy.
That's good to know. Cause yeah, I mean, I'm only going off of what the CD says. So yeah, thank you for that. So from your perspective, was there anything that changed in terms of kind of workflow on that particular album from the last one? Was it a totally different experience work
Um,
wise or?
well, the only difference, I guess, would be more familiarity.
Yeah.
Because we'd worked together in the past. I'd
Right.
come to know them and really like them as people. Um,
They
but
seem
yeah,
like a
I
really
mean,
fun band to work with.
yeah,
It seems that way.
yeah. Up until in Trump Lamond is when they were starting to have some internal issues,
Right.
which I won't go into. That's not my business to talk
But
about.
that was the last record with the classic lineup. It was. Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed. But no, I just always enjoyed working with them. And, Doolittle was the second independent project that I did
Wow.
after I left Reflection.
Yeah.
And you can imagine what I thought. I mean, the first time I pulled those tracks up on the desk, I'm like, holy shit.
Yeah.
This is like the coolest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
I was overjoyed and just had so much fun with them on all three of those records. And
And I think we should really go back to that because, as me being a listener, and I'm sure that most people that are going to watch this are huge Pixies fans as well. We heard the record, when it came out. I heard it way later because I wasn't even born in 88. I think it came out 88, 89, something like that.
yeah,
Even listening to it now with all the other alternative music and everything that's come out in decades since, you listen to it and you're like, okay, wow, this is definitely a super unique record. The lead lines on that album, on Doolittle in particular, the lead lines are super weird, but somehow they work. Charles as a frontman and a songwriter does like some of the most unconventional, kind of goofy, for lack of a better word, things on tracks, but that's his thing. Somehow he's able to
Yep.
take that stuff
Well,
and
that
and
was
make it
mostly
work.
Joey, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, there were times when we were doing some recording with Doolittle and Joey would, throw down a guitar part and Gil and I would just kind of look at each other like,
yeah.
really? And Joey would say, yeah, you say that now, but in 5 years.
Well,
And
I
Joey's right.
I remember reading something. I don't know if you can confirm this or not, but I remember reading somewhere that the solo for Hey was like a one take, like live thing, and he hit it on the first go. Do you remember that at all?
I I know that Joey got his parts quickly.
Yeah,
If anything, we'd always get on him a little bit about timing issues or something like that. But as far as, chord changes and, technique and all that, he was pretty much spot on.
on it.
He
Yeah,
could, he could nail it.
I'm not
So it wouldn't
surprised.
surprise me if that's the case.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've gotten to see him twice. I've seen Pixies twice. First time I saw Pixies, I remember distinctly just watching Joey the whole time because he'll just do like the weirdest, like, why the hell is he doing that thing? But once he lands it and he gets to the end of what he's doing, you're like, okay, I get it now.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well,
But
Pixies are still touring. In fact, they were here in
yep.
Charlotte a few days ago, and I was not able to go.
Hmm.
I saw them the last time they came through town, and they sound as good today as they
Yeah,
ever did. They sound incredible. They're a great live band.
they are. I just saw them. They came through Bridgeport, Connecticut with Modest Mouse, and I caught that date. That was
Yeah, I think this was the same tour.
Yeah, it was early. It was early on. It was an earlier date on the tour, but yeah, that was the second time I had seen them, and I was like, oh my god, yeah, like they don't miss all these years later. Still, they still sound great.
Yep, absolutely.
It's a testament to what they did. Around the same time that Doolittle came out, since we're kind of talking about that period, you also worked on Bob Mould's first record. You worked on his first solo album as well. I'm a huge Husker Du fan. I'm a huge fan of his solo work, everything. I mean, he's an amazing songwriter. He always has been. He still is. The music that he still puts
Yeah.
out now, as far as I'm concerned, is fantastic. Do you have any memories from that particular project, working on that record? Was it around the same time? You know,
Uh, just a little after.
okay.
But yeah, I have tremendous respect for Bob. He's a great guy. Uh, uh, yeah, we worked on that record. It was at a private studio up in the Catskills near Woodstock, New
Okay.
York.
I've been there, that area before. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a little town called Mount Tremper is where we were staying. We were staying in like this 200-year-old bed and breakfast inn in the middle of January,
Oof.
freezing cold,
Wow.
snow and
Okay.
ice everywhere. And Bob had rented a Jeep 4-wheel drive so we could get around. And we were the only people in the inn
Oh, wow.
until Friday night, and people would start showing up on the weekends to go skiing.
Okay.
But the rest of the week, it was like The Shining, dude. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
nobody, not even staff, no one in the building but us.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was kind of creepy, but it was cool.
Sounds
But
it. Yeah.
yeah, we worked at this private studio that was very nice. Had a huge Harrison console, great mic collection, and Bob and I just kind of hid away up in the mountains for a few weeks and recorded the record, and then we went to a studio just outside of Boston called Blue Jay to mix. And yeah, it was a really good experience. Bob's a very talented guy.
Still, I mean, and that record is so interesting to me because, coming out of a band like Husker Du, which was known for being just like a thrillingly loud, raucous band, Workbook has, I mean, and it's buried in on those Husker Du records, even though they're super loud and they can get chaotic. There's kind of a folky element to that record, and I think
Yeah,
there is, which,
yeah. No, Bob wanted to go a totally different direction. Um, I mean, obviously, when there's like cello on like 8 songs,
right.
and uh, yeah, Bob intentionally, went a different way with that record.
You're also credited in the credits for that. It says that you played percussion on See a Little Light, which became the big single. What exactly are we hearing on that track?
Um,
Do you
I used
remember?
to do, and I used to do that on a lot of the records that I produced. You'd be amazed at how many drummers can't shake a tambourine in time.
Right.
And so I'd play tambourine or
Gotcha.
shakers or whatever, on a lot of records.
I
And yeah,
gotcha.
I played some percussion parts on that record too.
Has it ever hit you in all of your decades of making records where you'll be like in a public space or something, you'll hear one of those songs and you'll hear like a tambourine part or something, and be like, oh yeah, I did that. Does that ever happen? I'm,
Um, I don't think anyone really remembers tambourine parts, do
well,
they?
besides the guy that records them, besides the guy that records them.
Yeah, no, I used to enjoy doing it because I always had very good timing and I could, knock it out pretty much in one take. And I played some tambourines on Doolittle.
Okay,
Um, but yeah, it was just a little fun thing to do.
sure. Yeah.
You know.
It definitely helps though having a guy like Bob who, when it comes to being a rhythm player, he's a fantastic rhythm player. Every
Absolutely.
when it especially, and you can hear it on that album because there's a lot of acoustic guitar and your right hand's got to be on it when it comes to doing that kind of thing. He
Yeah.
every every pluck of all the chords that he does, they're all consistent. It's not like he's flubbing anything.
Nah, Bob's very good.
Yeah.
Really good player and a really good guy.
He seemed
Very,
yeah.
very pleasant to work with. And I totally enjoyed that.
Yeah, I've never had the chance to meet him, but from anything that I've read or seen or anything, yeah, he seems like an amazing dude. He seems like a great guy.
He is. Absolutely.
So I'm going to jump forward a couple years now because right now we're kind of in the late 80s. I want to jump forward. So by the early 90s, you ended up working on a couple records for some bands that were based out of the New York hardcore scene. The bands I'm talking about Black Train Jack, who you had the Token Entry guys end up forming Black Train Jack. Does not sound like Token Entry at all. But then you also ended up working with Quicksand. You produced the Slip record, and of course Walters from Gorilla Biscuits and all that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So how did you find yourself getting involved with, those bands? How did you end up going from, you know, kind of more like we were talking about, like college rock and the alternative
Yeah.
boom to these bands that came from the New York hardcore sphere? How did that happen?
Well, my longtime manager, was an entertainment lawyer in New York, and he had connections with pretty much all the major labels and a lot of the indie labels as well,
Okay.
um, and was very well respected in the business. And he introduced me to A&R guy with Roadrunner Records, which is
Okay.
Black Train was on, um, and I ended up doing a few records with Roadrunner, that label.
Yep.
Black Train being one of them, and I think another one was Die Monster Die, and I actually started a record with the coolest band name ever, with a band called Karma to Burn, and I it's the only project I've ever walked away from. Um,
Really?
yeah, it was a very weird situation. I mean, the label wanted to go ahead and record uh, the tracks, but they didn't have a lead singer yet.
Oh, okay.
They they were without a vocalist, and I'm like, really? I'm recording, guitars and drums and bass, and I don't even know what the melody is to the song. And I'm
I,
like, this is
mm,
really strange. So anyway, I did it, and then a few months later, they had hired a vocalist, and this was at the Carriage House as well. We went to the Carriage House to record vocals, and it was just a disaster.
Geez. Okay.
I mean, an absolute disaster. And I called my manager up and I said, look, I, I can't have my name on this.
Yeah.
I just can't do this. And
Did the record come out? Like,
I think it eventually did, but I'm sure it didn't do much.
yeah, I've never heard of it. Karma to
Yeah.
Burn.
Yeah. Cool band name.
Very.
very strange project.
Sounds like
Uh,
I can't even imagine that. Because yeah, you can't. It all just sounds like music. Like there's nothing you can really base anything really structure wise off of if you got no melody there. That had to have been weird.
exactly. It was a nightmare. I said, okay, well, I'm producing tracks and I don't even know what's going on, you know.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. And I didn't want to disappoint they and our guy at Roadrunner, who was a sweetheart of a guy, and he had been kind enough to push a couple projects my way, and I didn't want to disappoint him, so I agreed to do it. But then in the end, I had to do what was best for myself too and cut
Right.
ties.
Well, you also ended up doing what's best for the record too. In the end, you don't want to be there doing a lackluster job either.
No, of course not. Of
No,
course not.
I think that that's a really important lesson that I think you learn as you go working on things and all that is you've got to know what your time and what your place is. You've got to be able to be honest with yourself when it comes to stuff like
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, and I was always honest with bands, or if they approached me about producing a record, and I would tell them straight up, I am not a songwriter. I don't play keyboards.
Right.
I don't program. I but that being said, I'm a very good editor. I can
Yeah.
get things to the point. You know, you got a minute long intro, that's too much. you
Mm,
know, blah blah blah. This isn't the 80s anymore. You got to get to the point.
sure.
Short attention span society we live in.
Yeah.
And very good on that level, and I think was very very good on the sonic level and pulling parts together and changing parts when they needed to be changed to fit. But I just always put it right up front. I'm not a songwriter. Don't expect me to come in and write half the song for you.
Right.
You know.
Because some bands will. Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, in terms of getting to the point and having songs that get to the point and that follow melodies and lyrics, you produced Slip by Quicksand, which is a record that just celebrated its 30th anniversary. It's kind of having a little bit of a resurgence now because it's been out of print for a while. That record's been out of print in terms of vinyl or CD or anything. It's been very hard to get. Now you can finally get it again. Thank God it's back in
Yeah.
print. But yeah, that is an album that to this day, when I listen to it, those arrangements and those songs are so effing tight. There's really not a second wasted on those records. And in terms of what Walter brought to it lyrically, he just spoke about this recently. They had like a Q&A thing. I think it was a Generation Records in New York, and he was talking. He was like, I was pretty nervous about writing lyrics for that album. So I kind of overcompensated and wrote a lot of lyrics, but I think it worked out in the end. And I would agree with him too, because a lot of those songs, listening back to them, instrument music wise, there's a lot of stops with the music that punctuates a lot of lyrics and stuff on that. I love it. When it comes to, records from that era, Slip is definitely one of the best of them. So from your perspective, I guess I'll kind of just let you go off. Can you tell us about, getting involved with that project, the making of that record, anything that you remember specifically from your perspective? Because this is also the first album we're talking about where you're the producer. We've been talking about engineer work so far. You produced this album. So from your perspective, 30 something years on, what do you remember from that time working on it?
Um, it was a tough project to do. We were working at Longview Farm, which is a residential studio just outside of Worcester, Mass.
Okay.
And it's I did several projects at that studio as well. It's always one of my favorite places. You move in, they cook for you. You know, you just walk out of your bedroom and go to the studio to go to work. And
Is it like Rockfield Studios, that place in England there? Is it kind of a similar setup?
I imagine it probably is, but it's
Okay.
it's a total resident. It's not there anymore, unfortunately.
Now, that's what I was going to ask. Okay.
Yeah, it closed down several years ago, which was a shame. I mean, a lot of huge bands recorded there, and a lot of very cool stuff was done there. Um, but there again, that was an unusual situation because I had originally been hired to engineer and mix, and uh, a guy that I knew that I considered a friend was producing. And I had worked with this guy. I'm not going to name any names.
That's
Uh,
fine.
I had worked with this guy, previously on records that had been done at Reflection. So I knew him. I said, "Oh, cool. Yeah, man, I'll be happy to do it." And as we started getting into the recording, it was pretty obvious that the producer and the band weren't really clicking.
Okay.
They just weren't really communicating. And I don't put any fault on anybody for that. It's just the way it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
Because like I said, I had a lot of respect for the for the guy that was producing. I
That they
knew him.
had. Right.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, one evening I get a call from my manager and he said, "Steve, let me talk to you about this Quicksand project." And I said, "Yeah, what's up, Ron?" He said, "Well, they want you to produce the record."
Mm.
And I was in shock. I was like, "Okay,
Right.
you know, what about this dude?" And he said, "Well, the band just really isn't clicking with him, and they seem to be clicking with you." And I said, "Sure,"
Yeah.
So I took over the project early on, and and there you go.
There you have it. I know that in that recent, I was talking about that Q&A that Walter just did at Generation. When he was asked about the production of the record, one thing that he noted, he mentioned you by name and said, we really wanted to work with Steve because of what he had done with Pixies and those Pixies albums. That was a huge thing for us because they were a band at the time where Pixies were a band for us that they were big enough to where people could hear them and people could really get out there and support them, but they were still small enough where we could look at them and go, wow, these guys are really great. And this is a really cool thing. We want that guy. So that's his take on it. That was his explanation on it. Was a lot of that record written when they came into the studio? Was it all pre-written and they were kind of ready to go? Okay, so there wasn't a lot of like tomfoolery in the studio. They just had it good and set.
Yeah, yeah. No, they had everything written and ready to go. And doing vocals on the record, it took a while to get vocals done because Walter's just like putting 110% into every
Yes.
line.
Yeah.
We were stopping and punching in a lot, because he had to catch his breath.
Yeah.
But yeah, we got through it. And, I mean, typically I would always do multiple vocal takes and then go back and comp, the best bits. And I do remember trying to build some melodic content here and there from the different takes,
Sure.
But yeah, it all worked out, man.
Oh, it definitely worked out. I mean, in particular, do you remember anything about recording the vocals for Omission at all? Because that
Not
track, what's
not
that? Okay.
not specifically.
The only reason I bring that one up is because that got carried over from the first EP that they cut. So it was a re-recording. And since we're just talking about vocals and, giving 110%, that's one in particular where I listened to it. He gives 110% on every single word, and it's so syncopated with how the music lines up on there. So I was just curious. But I can
Yeah,
imagine moments like that being ones where, yeah, he probably had to catch his breath in between takes. I can definitely imagine that.
absolutely, absolutely. When
Is that,
and I haven't listened to that record in ages, so you know,
do you remember? Do you, no, go
not
ahead.
go-
Oh, all right. Do you remember that album being one that was instrumentally, musically, was it recorded mostly live? Because they were a fairly live band. So was there overdubbing? Were they all in one room? Or how
well,
did
I
it
mean,
turn out?
typically I would always set the band up, but and then typically you would, you're really going for a drum track
Yep.
initially,
Getting
and
scratch tracks.
then you re-record bass, guitars, all that stuff. That's
Okay.
that's that's the typical process on pretty much all those records that were done. You
Gotcha.
know?
And we're hearing, I would guess, just based on the way it sounds, are we hearing just Marshalls with Gibsons on that album? Is that kind of what we're hearing?
A lot of it, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I always had my little bag of tricks. I would carry a decent sized shoulder bag with all my guitar pedals and stuff in it that I would carry around to sessions.
Okay, so
And
that So that I want to touch on real quick, and then I want to we'll move on to another record. But what I want to ask you about is in the decade since Slip has come out, and of course, the hardcore audience and all the post-hardcore fans, they love Slip. It's a classic in that world, no doubt. Walter has come out a lot over the years, and he's talked about, a big inspiration for that album, especially the way we wanted the guitars to sound, was My Bloody Valentine and all the shoegaze bands that were kind of coming out of England at the time. Now, when you go
Yeah.
to listen to a Gorilla Biscuits record or any of the work Walter did before that, none of that's there. Because at the time, you're talking like My Bloody Valentine, Loveless came out in like 91. And that was a lot of people, Quicksand included, really their first exposure to that genre and that style. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, since you're mentioning pedals, do you remember the band really wanting to play around with effects with guitars? And if so, in what way did that end up happening? Because they have vocally said, yeah, we really wanted to dive into that with that album.
Yeah. Um, you know, I don't know. It's like for me, I could instinctively dial up a guitar sound.
Yeah.
I would tell the guy, "Well, play me the part. Let me hear the part." And as soon as I heard the part, a light went off in my head. I said, "I know exactly where to go
Yep.
to get that right." And I carried, an array of pedals around with me. Sometimes, Vance had pedals too. It would either be something they had or something I had. And, surprisingly though, a lot of times it would just be the organic amp sound.
Yeah.
Dial up the amp just right, have the right guitar, get it in tune,
Yep.
and there you go. You know, um, Pedals are great.
Yeah.
Um, I love using effects and all that sort of stuff. But if you know how to mic up an amp, you you know how to dial in a tone. A lot of times you don't need pedals.
Sure.
Just go.
Yeah.
And my technique for miking guitars, I mean, it changed up over the years. But the thing that never left me
Yeah.
was the way Les Paul said you should mic a guitar amp,
Which is,
which is get yourself a flashlight, look at that speaker cone, put your mic directly in face, directly in the center of that cone. And that way you're getting 100% of what the amp is sending out, giving you. And, dial up the tone on the amp and you'll have a true picture.
okay.
There's guys that, mic them off to the side or do
Sure.
any of this. And you can, of course, you can do that.
Right.
If you
Every project's different.
exactly. But 99% of the time when I recorded guitars, that was the way I did it.
Okay. Is that what we're hearing on Slip? If you had to guess, is that straight on? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It
And
sounds like that too. Yeah.
sometimes during that time, I would use two mics on two separate speakers in the cabinet,
Right.
and then blend those two to get what I was looking for. But for the most part, it's one mic, center cone. There
Yeah.
you go.
That makes sense. Cause I mean, listening back to it, there's not like a big room sound on that album. It's very direct.
Yeah,
The guitars, as soon as that record starts with the phaser, the guitars more or less, they slap you right in the face, which is great. It's like you said, it all worked out.
yeah,
Absolutely. It's a classic record 30 something years on.
yeah. And that was my first time mixing a record at the Hit Factory in New York. Quicksand was mixed at the Hit Factory.
Okay.
And I got to meet Run DMC. They were working downstairs in another studio.
Really?
Yeah, Reverend Run used to come up to the control room and said, "Steve, you sure are making a fuck of a lot of noise in here." He was a cool, really cool dude. Yeah,
That's awesome. Well, I mean, yeah, that's again, I wasn't around in New York at the time, wasn't born, but
yeah,
you hear a lot about, the hardcore projects and the hip hop projects sharing more or less the same space and the same kind of circle back then. A lot of them had the same management too. A lot of hardcore bands and hip hop
well,
bands
yeah,
had the same management. Like Biohazard was with Rush Management. Rush Management was working with Public Enemy. You said Run DMC was in the same building. Well, the Quicksand record was getting made. I mean, do you
yeah.
remember anything about that? About there being like a real crossover of that stuff being around there back then?
Well, I mean, it wasn't unusual. If you're in a studio with a couple different studios, there'd be a hip hop
Right.
artist in one across the hall in the other studio, and I'm working on a rock record in the other room.
Right.
That happened a few times with me. I met a few of the big hip hop artists during that day, and it's all cool. It's
Yeah,
all good.
absolutely.
You know.
Run DMC, that would have been, let's see, that could have been maybe the Down with the King record, maybe around that time.
No
I don't
clue.
know.
No clue.
That's where they were at in the 90s. I figured I'd throw it out there. I'm a big
Yeah,
Run DMC fan, so that's cool to hear.
yeah. And another record that I was working on just outside of Los Angeles, um, it was a band called My Head, and it was actually an offshoot project from the guitar player that was in Suicidal Tendencies.
Rocky?
I'm
Rocky,
sorry?
Rocky George?
No, no. Uh, different guy.
Okay, they've
Uh,
had a million guitar players, so it's hard to
yeah,
think about which
yeah,
one. So many
yeah.
guitar players
Who
in that
knows?
band.
Who knows?
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, we were tracking a record. It was at American Recording, just outside of Los Angeles, and we were tracking that record. And across the hall was Warren G and the
Oh,
Dog.
wow. Okay.
You know, so yeah, we could always tell whenever they arrived because even in the studio they were bumping their music so loud in the huge SUV they were driving. You could hear it through the studio walls.
Like, okay, Warren's here.
Yeah, Warren arrived.
That's awesome. All right. So moving on from the quicksand stuff, I'm going to jump forward a couple more years because, okay, Steve, this is the whole reason this interview has happened today. I'm going to tell you a quick story.
All
So
right.
for everybody out there, I was in a two-piece band for a really long time. Guitar and vocals right here. I had a drummer, right? So naturally, when you're in a two-piece band, there's few two-piece bands that are very easy to get a hold of and check out. One of them was the White Stripes. I checked out the White Stripes and I was like, okay, like White Stripes are cool, but then I got a hold of this record. I got a hold of As Good as Dead by Local H. And I saw two dudes playing really fucking heavy music, for two guys, that is an extremely heavy set of songs. To this day, still out there making really heavy songs. So I saw that. I saw the music video for, I think, Eddie Vedder. I think it's probably that. And I was like, holy shit, I got to get a hold of this record. So I get a hold of the record. And I start, I was telling Steve before I got on here, I start tearing apart the liner notes. I want to know everything about this record. Recorded at the Carriage House in Stamford, Connecticut. So I'm like, whoa, like this is a local project. This was recorded in Connecticut. That's crazy. And then the other great thing about that record is the CD tray. There was like a kind of a blurry picture of the pedal board that Scott had back then, Scott Lucas had. So like I'm
Yeah.
like looking at that with like magnifying glass, trying to figure out how all that shit worked. Because again, it's two guys and it sounds fucking huge.
Yeah.
The other thing, so now years later, so Local H As Good as Dead, for better, more or less, it kind of changed the way I looked at just making music back then. Because again, two-piece bands got to stick together. So that was a big deal. Flash forward years later, one of my good friends, Alex, is showing me the Quicksand record for the first time, and he's showing it to me. And when I listened to that album for the first time, I thought the songs were great. I thought the songs are really cool, but I listened to it and I said, Alex, it sounds like Local H. The way this record sounds, I'm telling you, there's something similar about this. They have something in common. And he goes, you're crazy. He goes, there's no way these records have any relation whatsoever. No fucking way. So I was like, okay, it must just be in my head, whatever. Well, come to find out, you produced that album a couple years after, I believe.
Yeah, it would have definitely been sometime after
Yeah. Okay.
Quicksand.
Yeah. So I want to know work process wise, making As Good as Dead, Local H, was it similar to the Quicksand album in any respects, or were they totally different beasts, totally different projects?
Well, I mean, totally different projects in the nature of personnel.
Well,
You
yeah,
got two
yes.
guys. Um, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but early on with Scott's live setup, he had a separate pickup
Yes.
installed on his guitar that he would run through an octave pedal and a bass amp.
P bass pickup, yeah.
Yeah. So we did not do that in the studio because it was just too floppy.
Okay. So
bottom
that's
end was
what.
just too loose,
So, so was bass tracked like normal then?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we had a really good P bass, and Scott played bass, and uh, and there were actually some guitar parts on that record that were live with the drums.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
for example, the guitar on "Bound for the Floor," that rhythm guitar that was cut live with the drums.
Wow. Wow.
If you listen to it really closely, you can hear harmonics flying off the strings
Okay.
from time to time. And I'm like, that is so cool. I mean, it just happened, just by dumb luck.
Sure.
That's what was one of the reasons I really wanted to keep it. I said, yeah, duplicate that.
Right.
I
Yeah.
dare you. And so we ended up keeping that. I think probably another guitar port or two we kept. But yeah, that was recorded. Was As Good as Dead done at the Carriage House?
It was. That's what it says on the
Yeah,
liner notes. I believe
because
so.
the previous record I had produced, I know, was recorded at Reflection.
Like you
I
did
mean,
Ham Fisted, right? As well.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, I'd already gone independent at that point, but we recorded at Reflection because it was kind of like still my home base.
Right.
And then I think As Good as Dead may have been one of the first projects that I actually mixed with Tom Lord Alge.
Oh
Uh,
wow. Okay.
well, it's like I got to a point where, I'm just so bloody tired after going through all the sessions and recording and it's like I'm so tired I don't even want to walk over to the patch bay to patch up a compressor anymore.
Sure.
It's like so when I had the budget, my go-to guy was Tom Lord Alge because his mixes are just ridiculous.
Sure.
And so he mixed that record. It's a very raw sounding record, but
It
that
is.
goes without saying. Look at who you're dealing with.
Right.
you know, um, but yeah, I then ended up, having Tom mix a few of my projects, and
Okay.
we got along great. I haven't talked to him in ages either, but I'm sure he's still probably still at it.
Now talking about in terms of talking about, I want to go back to Ham Fisted for a second, but we'll get there. But so I guess the first thing is we talked about on the Quicksand record, the mic was very direct. It's right on the cone of the speaker. Is that what we're hearing on As Good as Dead as well?
Yeah,
Possibly. Because it sure sounds like it. Because again,
absolutely. I mean, that was the way I did it.
yeah.
That's pretty much every project. I'm directly on Axis.
Okay. It definitely works for a band like Local H, where so many of those riffs, like on like High Five and Motherfucker in particular, like you listen to that, and as soon as it starts, every hit on that guitar, it's so percussive. Like it's a very percussive album. The drums are always lined up in some aspect with the guitar on that record.
Yeah,
Big
yeah.
time. So do you remember? So we had a P bass for all the bass stuff that Scott did on there. I know in a couple of the music videos, there was a Gibson SG floating around. Did that make the cut for the album? Do you remember?
Very possibly. I
Yeah,
don't remember exactly.
sure.
I know that Scott had a Strat that he played a lot, but I'm sure there were other guitars that creeped in, which is usually the case.
Yeah. Yep.
You want to get the right guitar and the right amp to achieve what you're looking for. So that's very common to use different guitars and different amps. So
But the live rig for Local H never that's not what ended up going on in the studio. So all the fancy pedals and everything that he had going on, it was a totally different thing for the record.
well, I mean, we may have used some of the pedals. We just didn't do the whole guitar bass combo
Gotcha.
thing
Okay.
because like I said, the bottom end was just too loose, not well defined.
Right.
So let's just put a proper bass on.
Gotcha.
And
Did
call it.
anything so working on Ham Fisted, you produced Ham Fisted as well. Tell me a bit about kind of how you and the Local H guys got to know each other and work together, because you made both those two records relative. I don't want to say back to backs. There was definitely years in between,
Yeah.
but they were made
Yeah.
fairly close together. Like, how did that whole thing happen?
Well, there again, my manager in New York was very good friends with Joe Bossa, who was their A&R guy.
Okay.
He signed Local H, uh, to I think what was then called Polygram. You know, it's all part of Universal Music Group now. But anyway, um, so I think my manager had pitched me to Joe, and then we had a meeting, and I guess I probably had a phone conversation with the band, and we decided to do it. You know, so I mean that's kind of how it all happened initially, but
Yeah.
and then you know they made the trip to Charlotte, and we recorded it at Reflection, and Joe hated me initially because I made him
Really?
play to yeah because I was making him play to a click track.
Oh, okay.
He
Yep.
didn't want to, you know, and I said,
Most drummers don't.
well, you should. You
Yeah.
always should. And you know, when and I used to ask this question, I said, well, you know, look at the drummer. I say, well, what do you think your job is in this band? And about half the time they couldn't give me an answer. And I said, well, your job is you are the damn timekeeper.
Right.
You are the clock.
Yeah.
If you're not used to playing with a click, get used to it quick.
Mm.
Because we will be playing to a click track.
Yeah.
And you know, I would also tell them, I said, don't look at the click track as a policeman trying to keep you in time.
Right.
Look at it as your percussion friend sitting over here on your side who has perfect fucking timing.
Right.
Think of it that way.
Mm. Yeah.
Don't think of it as someone trying to hold you back or trying to police you. You know, think of it as this awesome percussion player.
Right. The best percussion player in the world.
And you know, there were a few bands that I worked with that I had a lot of trouble with drummers that never had played to a click,
Yeah.
and it was just a mess. But you know, and then after the fact, Joe said, "Well, I'll never do another record without a click track."
So yeah, so as good as dead was that just day one click came in and there was no issue?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. I mean, I always used a click track, even if I wasn't that strict about it. You know, if they sped up just an idiot's bit in a chorus or whatever,
Yeah.
and then fell back in line, if it felt good,
Right.
sure,
Yeah.
sure. As
It's
long as it
human
feels
beings playing music. So yeah.
exactly, exactly. As long as it feels good.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But I always had impeccable timing. So I mean, I would hear it if a drum track sped up or slowed down in a heartbeat. I would pick up on that. I
Yeah.
would go like, that second verse, man, is rushing it a bit, but
So
you know,
so important for a band like that too, especially on a lot of the tracks on Good as Dead. There's like random ebb and flows of tempo. Tempo kind of jumps around from song to song. There's one track on there, I can't remember exactly which one off the top of my head, but there's one where it sinks into a halftime thing for maybe like, I don't know, a couple bars, and then all of a sudden he's just right back on. It's not a D beat, but it's damn close to something that resembles a D beat. Like within maybe 30, 45 seconds. So yeah, if your drummer's not on it doing something like that, there's a big problem. So yeah, I can understand why that would be important. And decades later, it definitely paid off because yeah, Joe's playing on those albums it's phenomenal. Hits,
oh, he's a beast.
oh my
Joe is an
God.
absolute beast.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the first time I saw them live, and Joe's sitting behind the kit with no shirt on. And at the time, he had dreads,
Yep.
and all you could see was hair flying and arms flailing
Yes.
because he would sit so low on his drum throne, you know. And but yeah, Joe's an absolute beast.
I guess the other thing I want to touch on this record, because we talked about Walter with Quicksand giving 110%. Scott Lucas is another guy when I listen to those records. Guy gives 100 and maybe 20% on every single syllable that the guy sings.
Yeah.
So was recording vocals for that a similar process of like the guy definitely had to take, he needed some room to breathe in between, or did he have like Superman like stamina and he just ran through it? Like, what was that like?
As I recall, Scott's vocals went pretty quickly.
Mm,
I mean, he knew what he was up to, and he had it down. And yeah, as I recall, those vocals went relatively quick.
that is unbelievable. Because I mean,
Yeah.
I listen to those I listen to those records and those songs now. I can't even imagine, like, some of the things he pulls out of himself vocally on some of those tracks, I can't even imagine having to do, let alone now they still play a lot of those songs live when you go and see them. Oh yeah.
Well, some vocalists just nail it. It's
Yeah.
like I don't think I did more than two or three uh lead vocal tracks on Scott on any song. You know,
Wow.
which usually my minimum would be four or five. But
Yeah.
with him, it was like, well, hell, that first one was great. All right,
Yeah.
let's just do it again. Do
Have
it
a
one more
sit.
time for
Right.
me, you know.
Victory lap.
And a couple or three tracks, and you're done.
Yeah.
It's there.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess the other, so As Good as Dead becomes a massive album for its time. That record was huge. The videos were all over MTV. That it was a huge record. Quicksand record got a decent amount of MTV rotation back in the day too. That album had a slew of videos, and of course the Pixies albums also became massive, massive albums. What I mean, getting started as a producer, doing early engineer work independently. What did you think of all these projects that you had been involved with for more or less, they blew up. Like these were huge records and they were all over the world. People were consuming these projects. Did you have any thoughts about that at the time? Like, or were you just like,
Well,
it's the thing I'm doing and,
when you uh, get involved in a project, most of the time you've heard demos and you say, and oh, there's some good songs there.
yeah,
You feel like it's really good and that you can put your heart into it and really make something wonderful out of it. But you never know if it's going to be successful. And
right.
anyone who says that is kidding
Bullshit.
themselves. It absolutely. You
Yeah.
never know. You never know. It's like um, one of the biggest records I produced. It was kind of I can't you can't really label it alternative or straight up rock. It was kind of fell somewhere in the middle. Um, was the first record that I produced for Fuel,
Yep. I
and
read that on your credits. Yeah.
and I went to see them in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, uh, and I knew some of those songs were just really, really good.
Hmm.
And I remember seeing the show, and then we had dinner that night, and ended up recording together. And that was another one that I did at Longview Farm in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And then I mean, that record went platinum here as well as many other countries all over the world. It was a huge record.
Well, lots of radio play for Fuel all over radio.
And
Yeah.
still lots of classic rock radio
Yes.
play today.
Very
Uh,
much so.
but yeah, I mean, they blew up after that first major label record that I produced for them, and they just totally blew up. Excuse me. Um, Allergies.
I feel you. Pollen's in the air where I'm at.
Oh, it is here too, man. It is here too. As I've gotten older, my allergies have gotten much worse.
I
But
gotcha.
anyway, yeah, it was a huge record for them. It was a huge record for me. Made tons of money off that record.
Hmm.
But you were talking about As Good as Dead. That actually went gold as well.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what the Quicksand record has eventually ended up selling. I don't know if it ever made gold or not, but it had to have been pretty close, if not.
That also to that album in
Plus,
particular.
that was a different genre too. It wasn't
Yeah.
like they were doing regular commercial airplay and shit like that.
I
So
mean, it was amazing. It's amazing that an album like that got on MTV, period. Because it did. I mean,
true.
I do know that Omission in particular, I believe, was like a mainstay, like the 120 minutes rotation or whatever when it came out. But I also feel like a record like that, it's kind of a slow burn in respect to, like, I mean, hardcore and hardcore adjacent music right now with people my age is huge. Like people love that stuff now because of bands like, I don't know if you're familiar, but bands like Turnstile that are coming out now and bands like this who over like the last 10, 15 years have been going on like the underground hardcore circuit, but like they're blowing up now. Like Turnstile, the band I just told you about, they're in Taco Bell commercials now. So what's
Wow.
happened, yeah. So what's happened with a lot of kids my age is they've heard bands like, whether it's Turnstile or Knocked Loose is another band that kind of floats within the hardcore thing. Kids are hearing that and they're like, okay, like this is cool, but like, where is this all coming from? So then they're going back and they're finding the Quicksand records. So there's a lot of kids my age now that like they're just finding out about that album in particular now.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
yeah, I'd be curious to see. I doubt it probably exists somewhere. I'd love to see like a graph of like where the Quicksand record is now. Because yeah, like,
Yeah,
a lot of
I'd be
people.
curious to know too. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sure it did quite well, but
sure, yeah.
I have no idea how many copies it sold. Um, well, it's not about selling hard copies these days. Obviously, it's about downloads and
Yeah.
streams. Um, but yeah, it's funny because Helmet had contacted me about producing their next record after they heard the Quicksand record. They loved the sound of it and all that, and it didn't work out. I think because of scheduling conflicts and stuff like that.
Right.
But I did end up mixing a track for Helmet that ended up on the Crow soundtrack.
Oh, like that big soundtrack with like The Cure and Pantera on there and everything.
Yeah, there was a lot of different bands on there.
It's a good soundtrack. I've never seen the movie. Soundtrack is awesome.
It's been ages since I've seen the movie, but it was a cool movie.
The helmet thing that you brought up is interesting because then some of the Tom Capone from Quicksand then went and he formed Handsome
Yeah,
Peter, and then that record came out a couple years ago, or a couple years after all of that. That
right.
record's awesome. The album is so good.
Yeah, I always liked Tom. He was going through some things, and that's why he left Quicksand. He had to
Okay.
kind of address some things in his life, and but Tom always had a lot of respect for Tom. He's a good guitar player, really nice guy, kind of quiet, shy, you know, but not when it came to his guitar playing.
Oh
But
no. Well,
no, very cool guy, Tom. I thought the world of Tom, and I was sorry to see him leave the band.
yeah. So I guess I want to jump up to modern day here. This has all been amazing because I mean, there's a lot of stuff about the records we've talked about. There's only so much out there. So like this has really been a treat. So thank you again.
No worries, man. I appreciate you reaching out because I rarely get a chance to talk about the music business these days. Because I'm totally out of the business. I've been
Okay.
retired. I've been retired for over 10 years,
So
and
that's what I was going to ask. I was going to ask you what you're up to now in terms of recording and working with bands and stuff. But since you
no,
just
I'm
said,
not.
so what
I'm
made
not
you?
doing. I'm not doing anything at all, and I'm not actively seeking anything.
Okay.
I'm not really on top of what's new and awesome out there. I don't know. I just kind of just took a big step back and said, I'm much older now. I'm not going to be in the studio till 1, 2 a.m. in the morning. I just can't deal
Hmm.
with that. I can't stand what the business has become. Um,
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. I miss being in the studio. I
Sure.
loved being in the studio. Uh, Very rarely did I ever feel like I was going to work.
Yeah.
And not a lot of people can say that about their jobs,
No,
but
they
I
cannot.
fortunately can. I loved every minute of it for the most part. Some projects were more difficult than others and more nerve wracking, but I do miss being in the studio, but I do not miss the business whatsoever, Carl. The business has become even more convoluted than it always has been.
Mm.
And
In what way? In what way? Like,
well,
was there anything in particular you remember something like an intricate part
yes,
of something changing? You were like, what the fuck? If so, please share because I'm really curious.
yes. Well, back in the day, major record labels would develop an artist.
Yeah.
That's what A&R was all about.
Right.
And an artist may do 3 records for a label before they ever got any airplay or any recognition.
I
And
think I
that
know
was
where you're
cool.
going with this. Yeah, they gave people time.
Yeah, they gave people time to develop and bring them along, and which doesn't happen today at all. Today it's, do you have a hit single for me right now? If not, don't let the door hit you in the ass.
Yeah,
Um, and also, I think one of the biggest downfalls of the major labels was when the digital revolution began. They stuck with their old business model of selling hard copies, vinyl, CDs, cassettes,
sure.
when it should have been, instead of Apple Music or uh, Spotify or any of those streaming services, it should have been, when you wanted to buy music, you went to the Warner Brothers music store online. You went to the Universal Music Group online. You went to Sony online.
Right.
The major labels did not get behind the digital revolution,
They let the
and
tech
basically
companies do it.
and basically shot themselves in the foot by not doing that. And now major labels are a joke. I would never encourage a band to sign with a major
Hmm.
label. Never. Find yourself a good indie label. And
Sure.
if they have, major level distribution, all the better.
Great. Yeah.
But I would never advise a band to sign with a major label these days. It's a disaster. They
Well,
want they want your firstborn child.
it's yeah.
All these 360 deals where they want a
Oh,
piece of your
yeah.
touring, they want a piece of your merchandising, they want a
Everything.
piece of everything, and they'll take all your publishing if you let them.
Yeah.
And that was a big mistake that, a lot of the old time artists from the 50s and 60s, they didn't know anything about the business and they signed away their publishing to the labels, and now they're penniless when
Yeah.
their songs are still getting airplay on those type of radio stations, and they could be making that publishing money. You know, it's a
Yeah.
shame.
It's
It's a
it's a
shame.
sad it's a sad story that you hear time and time again from a lot of artists. I mean, especially people that from that were making alternative records in the '80s and the '90s and stuff. Where some people that were making these albums, they didn't know a lawyer, they couldn't afford a lawyer to read contracts and read
Yeah,
between the lines and really figure out what was going on. So unfortunately, like you said, yeah, some people got swept. They're
yeah,
still going through the residuals of that, unfortunately. The other
yeah.
thing that I'll say from my perspective with the indie labels versus major labels today, and you can correct me on this if it's off base, is watching documentaries, being a music fan, and doing my research and all that. You always get a sense with indie labels in the '80s, whether it was like Rough Trade or Sub Pop or
Yeah.
Discord Records, anything like that. Any indie label, they have a core audience for that label. Like there's people out there that, they love everything that, Discord puts out. They're going to buy anything that's on Discord just because they put their stamp of approval on it.
Yeah.
Nowadays, but now I don't know. Like, for instance, I don't know anybody that's like a Warner Brothers fan or like a Universal fan. They're like, oh man, everything that Universal puts out, I'm gonna buy the shit out of that. But like now, like I know people that they're in love with record companies like, like Polyvinyl out in Chicago, and anything Polyvinyl puts out, like they're gonna check it out simply because it's on that label, or Triple B, they're out of Boston. So an independent label to a certain degree now, aside from, getting hopefully better distribution and visibility on your records, they also, in a way, at least from what I've heard, I feel like they've always had their own kind of built-in fan base, more or less, of people that genuinely care. Yeah.
Well, that, I guess to an extent that could be true, very much so. But and you're talking about all these labels, you're still talking about, for the most part, a genre
Yes.
of music, and these
Right.
people are fans of that.
Right.
You- And so I think what you're saying is partially true, but in the same vein, if they're a really cool alternative band that's on this label, they're going to go buy that as well. You know,
Yeah.
but yeah, I know what you're saying. I mean, there used to be so many cool indie labels. Um, like I was mentioned earlier, between Boston and Georgia, um, there was a really cool indie label that was based out of the Triangle area here in North Carolina, called Dolphin Records, which had so many cool artists on it, regional artists. And
Was
they used to,
Homestead Records a Massachusetts label?
I don't recall, could be, I'm not sure.
That
I'm
was
not
from
sure.
something because that was around that time, mid '80s. I remember. I could be totally wrong about that.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Rough Trade. Studio that I used to work at in Boston called Fort Apache.
Yeah.
Uh, that's where I recorded Throwing Muses and Blake Babies and uh, gosh, I can't remember what else. I did a few projects there. But Rough Trade was downstairs in the same building.
Oh, really?
Fort Apache Studios, yeah,
So
yeah,
Fort Apache, I actually, I did not know that you worked at Fort Apache. I know about Fort Apache because the Dinosaur Jr. records were made at Fort
yeah,
Apache. At least Bug
yeah,
was in the late '80s, and that was another one. Like that was a textbook for me when I was
yeah,
younger, trying to figure out how to write songs and record music. So ripped that record apart and figured out Fort Apache. That's where it was recorded. Tell me
yeah.
what working at Fort Apache was like. Was that a fairly small place?
It wasn't a huge studio, but it was a very nice studio.
Yeah.
You could do whatever you needed to do there. No, no worries. My first association was when I met the producer who was also the co-owner of Fort Apache Studios, Gary Smith. Super nice guy, very talented producer and musician. He had come to Charlotte to Reflection because he was producing some stuff with the Connells.
Okay.
The Connells were a huge, huge college radio band back in the day. They didn't really have any massive uh, commercial radio success, but they always had a couple tunes on the top of the C&J charts, always.
Gotcha.
And an awesome band. They were from Raleigh area in North Carolina. And Gary had come, he was producing a record with them, and that's when Gary and I first met. And, I guess kind of the same thing happened. He was very impressed with what he was hearing, uh, very impressed with my skills behind the desk. And he asked me to come to Boston and, work with him on the Throwing Muses record. And at the time, I was still staff at Reflection. And unfortunately, the owner would not let me take outside projects.
Okay. I see.
He was really holding me back. And, I love the studio. I loved all the projects. I mean, I did so much, I learned so much at that place. And, very grateful to the owner for giving me a chance to get my start there. And, but I had a different circumstance that came to light in my life. I had inherited about 5 acres of land just outside of Charlotte that had been part of my dad's family farm.
Okay.
And, I kept getting asked to do outside projects, either to come mix or come engineer. And I couldn't do it
Right.
because the owner wouldn't let me. And
Gotcha.
I'm like, dude, you're just holding me back.
Yep.
And I went to my family and I said, well, I've got this land. I'm thinking about selling it. Does anybody want to buy it? And they all declined. So I sold that piece of property, which gave me a little bit of a cushion. And I put in my notice at Reflection. And the next thing you know, I'm in Boston. We're doing Throwing Muses record.
At Fort Apache.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay. So that was it. So that was your first independent project then, right?
absolutely. That was my first. And then Doolittle was my second. And then, I think we did Blake Babies not too long after that as well. Juliana Hatfield's band, Tanya Donnelly.
Yeah.
Um, um, no, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Tanya was in Throwing Muses with Kristen
Right.
Hirsch.
Tanya, right. And then she
Yeah,
was on the first Breeders record, I believe,
I
eventually.
believe.
Yeah.
And then she had that band Belly,
Yep.
and
She was in
they
Billy.
had a hit, I think. Yeah, Tanya's a sweetheart. She's awesome. And in fact, I recently had a conversation with her. Well, it's been several months ago now because I think I'd mentioned earlier that Gary Smith unfortunately passed away.
Yeah.
And, he had been managing her career as well, and
Okay.
she kind of was doing all the arrangements and asked people to contribute a few words about Gary, and which of course I did, and then we had a nice conversation afterwards. But yeah, sad to hear about Gary too. He was a great producer.
Yeah. All right. I'm trying to think of where to go now because that kind of just hit me. Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to just bring a whole mood
no,
down.
no, no, no. It's fine. It's fine. I just want to acknowledge that. But I think we got to this point because we were trying to talk about the music business of today versus yesterday. But yeah, it's a
Yeah,
totally different. The big thing that I think I get out of what you just said is that there's not a lot of labels that are willing to give an artist time. You know,
no, there's
I,
not.
and I
There's not.
think unfortunately, a lot of the people that I talk to and people that I work with, they're willing to give bands time and they're willing to follow, bands' trajectories and careers because they're music fans, they are. When you talk about the general populace, though, that, they like what they hear on the radio and that's it, I would argue that that population of people has grown so impatient, and they're
Yeah,
and they're
yeah,
not willing to do it. So, when you have massive corporations that have to pander to massive groups of people, I guess that's how it shakes out if you have to be callous and cold about it. But I don't agree with it. I think it's
yeah.
conversation. The
And
conversation
so,
that we're having needs to be had.
yeah, and so many things have changed as well as far as the way bands are broken. As I
Yeah,
mentioned earlier, college radio was where bands were broken. If
sure.
they did well on college radio, then a major label would get behind it and start pushing it to commercial. I mean, there are tons of bands that broke on college radio.
Of course.
Talking Heads, The Police, Bob,
REM.
just countless bands that broke on college radio, and then went on to be massive.
Huge.
REM, yeah,
Yeah.
the first two REM records were done at Reflection.
Oh, wow. Okay. You
Yeah,
were you were not there at the time.
yeah, I was staff at the time.
Did you do
Don
any work
Dixon,
on the record or were you just in the building?
very, very little. I assisted from time to time, but it was all handled pretty much by Don Dixon and Mitch Easter,
Okay.
producers on the record, and both of them are really good engineers. So
Oh, it shows those albums, though both
they're
Murmur
groundbreaking.
and Reckoning are still in my rotation today. It's
They're
yeah,
groundbreaking. I mean,
yeah,
just amazing sounding records even today.
yes,
Really well done.
by
Well,
all
those
means.
guys, the band, they're all good musicians, and with Don and Mitch at the helm, you can't go wrong.
Yeah, no, that seems like a winning combination there.
Every time.
Yeah,
I learned so much from both of those guys in my early engineering days. I learned so much from those guys. In fact, the first major label project I ever engineered was for Warner Curb, and it was a band called Arrogance, which was Don Dixon and Don Dixon's band. He and Robert Kirkland started that band.
okay,
That was the first major label record I ever engineered. And yeah, Don and I did so many projects together, and Mitch, and I just gained a wealth of information from those guys.
yeah.
And I mean, Reflection was such a great breeding ground.
It sure
Uh,
sounds like it, man.
it was, man. I mean, we were doing so much cool stuff. And, there would be other engineers that would come in from time to time and other producers. And I just sat there like a sponge
Right. You
and
learn.
absorbed
Yeah.
it as much as I could and learned from all these people that I respected. And um, yeah, it was a great place to learn and to hone my career. Absolutely.
Sure sounds it. But yeah, REM though, they had those guys had took time though. They had records over records is when they really that it goes back to our point. As great as Murmur and Reckoning are, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, those are my two favorites. But if you want to talk about like commercial success and all
Yeah,
that, I mean, they only really they started writing the really palatable, big single songs on Document, and that's 3 albums later.
yeah,
But they were
exactly.
afforded the time to get there. Because that's
Exactly. That's exactly my point. And that
yeah,
just doesn't happen anymore.
yeah,
It's a shame. It just doesn't. But
yeah.
it's what the business has become, and I don't want any part of it.
And I respect that. I respect that because there are people that, you just get the sense you talk to people that have been around, long and they're still in it, but you get the sense that they're complacent and it's just, I do what I do or whatever. But if you're in the music business, and I'm sure you can attest, you gotta love every single second of it. Like you said, you worked at studios and you never felt like you were working. I'm sure there was points, but you enjoyed yourself, and you have to if you're making art. You have to.
You got to put your heart and soul into it, or it's not worth doing, you know. And I have very much cherished my time in the business, and I look back on it fondly. But it is definitely in the rearview mirror at this point.
Well, hey man, you got a hell of a body of work to look back on, and it's still getting people like me to write my own stuff and make my own music and do this whole thing myself. And you played a big part in that. And I'm sure there's other people that might not even know that you're indirectly involved in their story, but you worked on a lot of records that changed a lot of people's lives. So that needs to be accounted for 100%. So you've got a
Well,
lot to be proud of, no doubt.
well, that's very kind of you to say. I appreciate that. And I just wish everybody out there, that's still trying to hold a band together and do it. I just wish them the best of luck. And you know, you gotta put 100% into it. And um, it's just a different world out there today than it was when I was coming up in the business.
Sure, sure. Well, that sounds like a pretty good place to wrap things up. Do you have any other closing remarks on things or?
I think I've rambled on long enough.
All right. Well, that sounds good to me. Steve, thank you again so much for putting this together. It was an absolute treat. This was wonderful.
No problem, Carl. Thanks so much for reaching out.
100%. So at this point, I'm going to stop recording it, and then Steve and I are going to get on our way. We'll wrap things up. But if you have not, noisespower.weebly.com, we've got tons of articles about a ton of the bands that we talked about and covered today, reviews, top fives, that whole kind of thing. This interview will be there available as well. You'll be probably watching this on YouTube. But yeah, links in the description for everything. Go check out some of the records that Steve has been a part of because they fucking rock, and you should know a lot of them if you don't. So with that, Steve, thank you, man. This has been awesome.
No worries, man. Thank you.